Good afternoon, everybody. This is Donna Curtin from Pilgrim Hall Museum, and I'm welcoming all of you to our first Saturday virtual history tour presented as a collaborative program of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum. So today's talk is a strangely titled From Coal Grates to Tomatoes. I guess we're going to share some unusual information with you today. First appearances in Plymouth. Now, as many of you know, Plymouth has been, well, let's say, a little tangled up in the quest for firsts for a very long time. Plymouth's early history is, of course, richly significant in many ways, particularly its symbolic significance in narratives of America's founding. And in this regard, Plymouth has often been packaged up, if you will, to emphasize a variety of firsts. The first permanent English settlement in America, and most famously, of course, home of the event known as the First Thanksgiving, and many other significant firsts in governance, in law, and in areas of ordinary life. But of course, we know that in fact, Plymouth was not the first English colony to be established in the Americas. And if we considered European colonization more broadly, Plymouth was even more of a latecomer. And yet there are many visitors to Pilgrim Hall Museum, for example, who seem to be surprised to learn that Plymouth was not the first, with the Mayflower's arrival in 1620. This interesting graphic at Pilgrim Hall Museum unravels a little bit that particular misperception. It shows a number of earlier explorations and European settlement efforts. And here is a more recent illustration in needlework elaborating on the explorations, the landings, and the colonizing efforts that predated the 1620 arrival of the Mayflower Pilgrims in Plymouth. This particular scene is being stitched as part of Pilgrim Hall Museum's Plymouth Tapestry project. And we do have some panels on display at the museum. This particular panel is still being worked on in the artist's studio, and we're looking forward to its completion. So if Plymouth Colony was clearly not the first, there are yet many historical firsts here as the town and the community evolved, some of great significance and others perhaps of more local interest. And today's virtual tour is a somewhat eclectic sampling of some Plymouth firsts from different eras. We're going to start with what we might think of as the first road map showing Plymouth Colony's first street. Here is Governor William Bradford's famous sketch of the colony's early layout, which appears on the first page of Plymouth's Great Book of Deeds, one of many manuscript volumes of the original colony records that are today housed at the Plymouth County Registry of Deeds. Bradford's caption for this drawing is "The Mearsteads and garden plots, of which some first laid out 1620. That is, it appears to represent the first house lots that were assigned to the Mayflower passengers on the colony's first laid out street. This street was renamed a couple of centuries later in 1824 as Leyden Street, and that is how most folks know it today, as a landmark of Plymouth's downtown area. But if we go again to Governor Bradford's map, we can see 7 house lots on, you actually have to sort of reverse the image because so you can see that the top of the hill is actually at the bottom of what's showing on the map screen, and it's as you go up the top of the illustration, you're heading down the slope of the hill. So we see 7 house lots with the names assigned to those homes on the south side, which is along the town brook side. It doesn't include the other side of the street, nor does it include the 4 houses that are documented as being there at that time, having been built for the use of the plantation and mentioned in Mort's relation. So obviously this drawing is not complete. And nevertheless, this map with other evidence has been the basis for envisioning what the early Plymouth settlement looked like for a very long time. Now, Plymouth historian Jim Baker recently interrogated Bradford's map and the generations of assumptions about it in an article for the Mayflower Quarterly. He identified discrepancies and these omissions and concluded that the map was a draft version of the effort to lay out these first home lots, and it does not in fact reflect what was actually assigned. And very convincingly, Baker points to the map's allocation of lots to two single men, and you can see them here on this sketch, Peter Brown and John Goodman, as an indication of its inaccuracy. In the first published account of the colony in 1622, Mort's Relation, it's revealed that when the street area was being measured out for houses to be built, the Pilgrim settlers quite pragmatically, quote, took notice of how many families there were, willing all single men that had no wives to join with some family, so that we might build fewer houses, which was done. Obviously, the lateness of the season and the need to have shelter were imperatives at the time, rather than providing everybody with their own independent housing. But for this reason, the identification of two single men on the list and other reasons marshaled by Baker, Bradford's map is now quite recently understood as an unrealized draft. However, in one respect, Bradford's early road map is accurate because it delineates the two principal thoroughfares of the early colony, called very simply by Bradford, as you can see, the street, and the highway is that little cross piece. Now, we might also note at this point that the designation the first street has something of a vanishing impact on the history of the Wampanoag village of Patuxet, which preceded the English colony in this place. If we consider the history of the place rather than the history of the colony, the first street would of course not be that one which was laid out in December of 1620, but a far more ancient byway. Let's move on to another significant first, however. This is the first English wedding in Plymouth colony. It was held 6 months after the Mayflower arrived at Cape Cod in November of 1620. The pregnant Susanna Jackson White had made the Atlantic crossing with her husband William and son Resolved. She gave birth to a son, Peregrine, in Provincetown Harbor aboard the anchored ship. But as the winter set in, the colonists began to fall sick. And by spring, half of them were dead, including Susanna's husband, who succumbed on February 21st, 1621. By the late spring, the young widow had found, if you will, consolation in the company of Edward Winslow, whose own wife, Elizabeth, had perished on March 24th. On May 12th, 1621, Susanna White and Edward Winslow were married. According to William Bradford, May 12th was the first marriage in this place, which according to the laudable custom of the Low Countries was thought most requisite to be performed by the magistrate as being a civil thing, and nowhere found in the gospel to be laid on ministers as part of their office. Civil marriage was an important innovation introduced by the Pilgrims to America. They encountered the practice during their years of exile in Holland, where couples were married at the State House by magistrates. And this differed from lawful marriage in England, where a Church of England priest performed a church ceremony. The separatists adopted the Dutch custom. It suited their religious beliefs and also their particular circumstances in a new colony without an ordained minister. As they had experienced in Holland, wedding couples in early Plymouth were officiated over by a magistrate, and these magistrates included Governor William Bradford, Captain Miles Standish, Isaac Allerton, and Edward Winslow. In 1635, when back in England as the colony's agent, Winslow was actually brought before the Archbishop of Canterbury to defend this marriage practice in the colony. He pointed out, as Bradford did, that marriage was not defined as a sacrament or specified as the province of ministers in the Bible. And Winslow pragmatically observed that the colony lacked a minister and no one would be able to marry at all unless by civil ceremony. Bradford points to the significance of this Plymouth first in this way. This practice hath continued amongst us not only them, but hath been followed by all the famous churches of Christ in these parts to this time, anno 1646. Now, a very different historic first, and a timely one considering some of our recent weather events, is the first recorded hurricane in New England. Bradford describes this in some detail, and the account is also published by Bradford's nephew, Nathaniel Morton, in his 1665 printed history of the early colony, New England's Memorial, which was very heavily derived from his uncle's journals. August 15, 1635, a little before daybreak, a storm came in from the southeast with great violence to the amazement of many. It blew down houses. It took the roofs clean off of some buildings, and vessels were lost at sea. There were 20-foot-high swells reported south of Plymouth, and the Wampanoag along the coast were said to have climbed into the trees for safety against the storm surge along the coast. Hundreds of thousands of trees were damaged or destroyed. High pines were broken. Stronger trees were uprooted entirely. And as Bradford tells us, young walnuts and oaks were twisted by the wind into bizarre and curious shapes. The storm lasted about 5 or 6 hours, and the marks of it remained for many years afterwards. But we also know that during the blow, a bark, a small vessel belonging to Isaac Allerton, one of the important leaders of Plymouth colony, had been en route between Ipswich and Marblehead, and during the storm it was driven onto a rock and dashed to pieces. Aboard her were at least 2 families, the family of Anthony Thatcher with his wife and his 4 children, and the Reverend John Avery with his wife and 6 children. A total of 23 passengers were aboard, and 21 of them drowned, including both of the wives and all of the children. Thatcher and Avery were able to climb out onto the rock for a time, and were said to have been gripping each other's hands for support when a wave came and took Avery. Thatcher survived, and he ended up a grantee of land and a town official through the rest of his life in the settlement at Yarmouth. Now moving on to another important first, and we have sort of a tandem pair here. We're going to talk about the first published history of Plymouth. But to do that, we need to meet Dr. James Thatcher, MD, who was born in Barnstable in 1754, but died here in Plymouth in 1844. And I know some of you who have taken our in-person tours of Burial Hill have visited his grave on the east slope of Burial Hill. Now, when he was just a youngster at age 16, Dr. Thatcher apprenticed to study medicine down in the Cape, and a few years later, it was 1775, an eventful moment here in the colonies, and at age 21, he enlisted in the Continental Army as a surgeon's mate. He served throughout the duration of the war to 1783, and in the process became a very skilled surgeon. After the war, rather than returning to Barnstable, he returned and settled here in Plymouth and opened a lucrative medical practice, but he also began to write. He had very far-ranging interests, especially in the areas of science and medicine, and published on a variety of subjects: the modern practice of physic in 1817, observations on hydrophobia in 1821, the American orchidist in 1822, and in 1823, he wrote a military journal, which was his war memoir of the Revolution. Dr. Thatcher was a cornerstone of local history. He was a founder of my organization, the Pilgrim Society, which built Pilgrim Hall Museum. And Thatcher was the first librarian and keeper of the cabinet at Pilgrim Hall Museum. In 1832, he published the first printed history of the town of Plymouth, which he presented as a minute narrative of the settlement of the oldest town in the New England territories. And in this book, he records for the first time in print the story of Plymouth Rock, including the patriotically inspired effort to relocate it to Town Square next to the town's Liberty Tree, which occurred in 1774. But Thatcher mentions a whole boatload of firsts, and among them, what I will talk about briefly, a rather mundane milestone, really. The first brick made in Plymouth, according to Thatcher. In 1643, a watch house was built of brick on Burial Hill, which was then known as Fort Hill. And this is actually the earliest reference to brick in the colony records. The watch house's brick construction, and you can see this little monument, which is there today, marks the spot where the watch house was erected. This brick construction was unusual for the early colony. Houses were generally earth-fast, post-hole type construction, and this is one reason why archaeological remains of early dwelling houses are really rare and don't provide a lot of the physical evidence that stonework or brickwork would. The watch house was part of the colony's defense at a time of heightened tensions between Indigenous peoples and English settlers following the Pequot War, and its sturdier structure reflected that uneasiness in colonial Indigenous relations for some years to come. But like the other fortifications that were built on Fort Hill, it eventually fell into ruin following the brutal suppression of Native communities in the wake of King Philip's War. So the watch house itself did not survive. However, Thatcher noted in his own time that while a grave was being dug on the summit of Fort Hill, a large amount of brick had been found a few feet below the surface, and this was possibly the remains of the watch house construction. Now, brick making, here's the close-up of that little marker that you can see today on Burial Hill. Brick making really was not a very complicated process, and bricks could be made, could and were made locally from early in the century. For example, the first brick kiln said to be established in Massachusetts was in Salem as early as 1629. Now, the watch house bricks were likely made specifically for the job rather than as an ongoing enterprise. However, the brick maker is identified as a man named Grimes, and according to Thatcher's reading of the colonial records, he seems to have been making his bricks in the field below where Pilgrim Hall Museum stands today, which is sort of interesting. Grimes supplied the bricks for the watch house for 11 shillings per 1,000. Now, like Thatcher, there are other Plymouth historians who've attended to some early firsts, and perhaps none more so than one of my favorite Plymouthians, William T. Davis, a prodigious researcher who spent many, many hours reading the original records of Old Plymouth, including literally thousands of deeds. In 1906, at age 84, William T. Davis published a look back to the world of Old Plymouth, to the experiences that he had had growing up in the historic town in the early 19th century, and his title was right to the point, Plymouth, Memoirs of an Octogenarian. But he had a number of earlier works as well that were important. A History of the Town of Plymouth in 1885, Ancient Landmarks, based on that extensive deed research in 1883, and also numerous genealogical and historical volumes, including an extensive series of the records of the town of Plymouth. It was a considerable body of scholarship and historical editing that was capped by this more personal memoir that appeared in print shortly before his death, which occurred in 1907. And in the preface of that last book, Plymouth Memories, Davis tells us in his own words what he wanted to achieve. By the death of every person, something within the range of his study and knowledge is lost beyond recovery. In publishing this book of memories, it is my desire to rescue from oblivion persona and events coming under my observation during a long life, and to make a record of habits, customs, and fashions which have prevailed at different periods within my knowledge. The book is not intended to be either in any sense an autobiography or a mere collection of interesting reminiscences, but a legacy which I wish to leave for the benefit of those coming after me. The long-lived Davis was an important figure in 19th century Plymouth, by professional lawyer and a banker and also a town selectman, but he may have made the most notable difference to Plymouth by paying close attention throughout his life to pretty much everything in his town. People, places, activities. If you want to know how families lived, where they lived, what they were like as people, Even details who was the last person to wear colonial-style knee breeches instead of modern pants in Plymouth. When did people stop the ancient practice of wood fires for heating and cooking? How did Plymouth kids make their own homemade footballs? Even what the local teachers were like from the students' point of view, Davis is the source. He captured real-life stories of not only his own life and times, but the generations before him, and these memories were indeed the legacy that he wished to create. So gleaned from his reading of countless property records, the town records, and also from his very far-ranging and broad interests and recollections, Davis reported on many innovations in his hometown, both historical and contemporary. So let's just look at a couple. Well, Plymouth's first whaling venture, certainly a significant milestone in the history of this maritime town. According to Davis, it took Plymouth 200 years for Plymouth to try to develop a whale fishery. Before then, there was the precedent of colonial law dealing with beached whales. 2/3 of any beached whale belonged to the town, and 1/3 to any resident that found one, cut it up, and tried the oil. But in 1821, Plymouth's first whaling company was formed. This was a venture undertaken by members of the Bartlett and Barnes families, with Isaac Lothrop and Thomas Hedge, which are very closely connected with our colleagues at the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, as they own Thomas Hedge's house, and also with Richard Holmes Jr., who later died at sea off Lima, Peru. Now, these at the time were mostly young men. They were willing to take a risk with this investment, and the fitting of their first ship of 345 ton, named in honor of Plymouth's early history, the Mayflower, actually energized the local maritime community. It created ancillary work for coopers, bakers, chandlers, and merchants, and of course employed sailors, all of the other activities that were related to the fitting out of a ship for long voyages. The Mayflower, can't even call it the Mayflower 2 because we have our modern 1957 reproduction with that name, but the Mayflower whaling ship sailed for the Pacific in the fall of 1821, and it was at sea for 3 years, not untypical for a whaling venture in that region, returning at last with 2,000 to 3,000 barrels of oil, a successful voyage. And in the meantime, some of these same investors had built an oil and candle factory to help process the whale materials into a product that then could be marketed and sold. They sent out a second whaler the next year, 1822, named the Fortune. And a couple of other voyages followed. But unfortunately, Plymouth really was not able to compete with New Bedford's very spacious harbor or Nantucket's well-established fisheries, and it never really took off as a significant whaling port. Now, another thing that Davis mentions is Plymouth's first newspaper. He was growing up at a time when Plymouth was really starting to shake off its identity as a small farming community and was becoming more of a mercantile and manufacturing center. And also, Plymouth was the county seat, so it had that distinction as well. Between Davis's grandfather's childhood and his own town, the town's population doubled to about 4,800 people in the year 1830. And this really represented in some ways a housing boom for Little Plymouth. New streets were being laid out. There were new industries along the Town Brook Waterway and in North Plymouth. There were fisheries and activities like these whaling ventures. There were new institutions. Banks were created and formed here. And of course, there was even a museum, Pilgrim Hall, which opened its doors in 1824, and a new sense of Plymouth's history and identity after its 200th anniversary was observed with fanfare in 1820. And one of the signs of this exciting time in Plymouth was the establishment in 1822 of a newspaper, the Old Colony Memorial, which is still published in our town today. Davis writes about the founders and the editors of the paper and his memories as a boy seeing the printing press run every Friday evening. He knew all the typesetters and the printers. He would go into the office after supper to help fold the papers, all done by hand. The press itself was hand operated by 2 men and printed on one side at a time at between 200 and 300 pages an hour. Now, I can't tell you as a historian what a great benefit it is to have a local paper over this span of time, where you can go back and look something up that occurred, as long as it occurred after the beginnings of the paper in 1822, to see how it was being presented, to find some particular details. It's another great historical resource that we have and access here in Plymouth in doing research, particularly for the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, Davis considers a lot of Plymouth's economic developments. He details the introduction of a range of manufacturing efforts, and he charts this evolution of the town from the fisheries to the factories. But he also sometimes helps weave a story of people and processes connected to its history. And so, as sort of a more thinking county-wide, one of the things he talks about is the creation of a foundry to cast Meetinghouse bells. A bit obscure, I would say. But the first Meetinghouse bells made in the country were cast in Plymouth County, not in the town of Plymouth, but in the area of Abington. And I think it was a part of Abington that's actually now part of Whitman today, by an individual, Aaron Hobart, in the 1760s. Now, Davis tells us that Hobart learned the craft from a deserter from the British Army named Gallimore, who had been a bell founder by trade. And we do know that by 1769, Hobart is actually advertising in Boston newspapers for casting of bells at his furnace in Abington. And the editor of the paper, the Old Colony Memorial, commented it was a very, well, actually, excuse me, it was the Boston paper, not the Old Colony Memorial, my mistake. The editor of this Boston paper commented, it was a very fortunate circumstance that bells could now be cast in this country and that we need not be obliged to send to England for them. Hobart also cast cannon and shot. And this occurred, of course, was his principal work during the period of the American Revolution. At some point, Paul Revere came to speak to Hobart, and it is said Hobart showed Revere how to create bell molds. Hobart's son returned with Revere to Boston to apprentice with him. And after the Revolutionary War, Revere started his own bell foundry in 1792, casting bells for many years. His sons, Joseph and Paul Jr., worked with their father in casting the bells, and Revere cast over 400 bells between 1792 and 1828. And of course, one of these Revere bells has pride of place as Plymouth's town bell. That is actually in the National Memorial Meetinghouse Bell Tower today. Another first that Davis talks about, and again, in the more obscure category, is the first coal grate. And you might think, well, why is this important? But Davis points to the coal grate as illustrating what was to him a very impactful, sort of daily felt shift in the everyday lives of Plymouthians as people started burning coal in stoves instead of burning wood in the fireplace. And of course, for thousands of years, people had relied on wood as their main source of heat and cooking. So this is truly a millennial shift with the introduction of this new kind of fuel and the new technologies to burn it efficiently to heat homes. Now, coal, meaning not charcoal made from burned wood, but actual excavated coal, was known and used in 18th century America, but still most households used wood for burning. There's an early 19th century memoirist, the Reverend George Lennon, whose sort of account was published in the 19th century. And he said that, blacksmiths tend to be using the coal in their shops, but most local people were not accustomed to using coal. Coal in colonial era New England was mostly imported from England. This is, you can find in 18th century Boston newspapers, they advertised sea coal, S-E-A, sea coal, which would be coming from places like Newcastle and Scotland, and Welsh coal. And this was imported and it was rather expensive. However, years of embargo in the early 19th century and then the outbreak of war in 1812 interrupted the importation of and shipping of coal from overseas. And this encouraged Americans to actually look for native sources of coal. Anthracite coal was found in the Pennsylvania region, and it began to be mined, taken out of the ground, and it was available, less expensive, and was sort of an appealing new product for people to try. So here is where we enter into the coal grate territory. The earliest anthracite coal grate was cast in the United States about 1820. And it does seem, from what Davis tells us, it did take a while for this new heating technology to reach the provincial outskirts here in Plymouth. He observes the first coal grates being used locally here in 1830, and he shares the credit for the introduction of the coal grates with his own family, the Davises, and with James Thatcher, noting that Thatcher and also Davis's own mother were the very first to set up coal grates in their homes. I'd like to point out to you there is an exquisite early coal grate on the second floor of the Hedge House Museum. So if you go there and take a tour, that might be an interesting thing for Dr. Mason to show you. One of the other things that Davis tells us about is the first tomato in Plymouth. And he credits its introduction to Dr. Thatcher, noting that in many things, Thatcher was always a little in advance of his generation and was inclined to adopt new ideas before they were sufficiently tried, though in others he was a successful pioneer. I wish we knew more about Thatcher and the tomato, but unfortunately his particular views of the tomato, how successful he was in growing it, whether he liked eating it or cooking with it, does not seem to have been recorded. Tomato historian Andrew W. Smith, in his book, The Tomato in America, Early History, Culture, and Cookery, has documented that colonial Americans were rather slow to incorporate tomatoes into their everyday cooking, but some did enthusiastically embrace the tomato, grow them, and eat them. And there was even something of a tomato boom in the 1820s and 30s, which may have been about the time that Thatcher was experimenting with growing tomatoes here in Plymouth. But the tomato had a little taint of suspicion that attached to it from early sources such as John Gerard's 1597 English Herbal that said the tomato was a poisonous and cold and moist fruit that was not good for your health, of rank and stinking savor. And of course, they connected it with the deadly nightshade family, and so thought perhaps it wasn't a good thing to eat. So the English had developed a suspicion of tomatoes that in other hotter climates, the tomato was much in Mediterranean climate countries, particularly the tomato was much more deeply and anciently embraced. And of course, it has a history of ancient usage as well in the Americas. But in this tomato growing season, we do hope that the pioneering Thatcher was a fan of the fruit, and we look forward to maybe finding some further evidence about the tomato's first appearance here in Plymouth. Davis also recounts the appearance of another exotic plant, the banana. He says, I remember the first one I ever saw in Plymouth Memories. It was about 1833. Captain Samuel Roger of the schooner Capital, which belonged to Daniel and Abraham Jackson, brought the first bunches of bananas to Plymouth. The captain gave some to Abraham Jackson, and Davis saw them hanging from a tree in Jackson's yard. The bunch was of a yellow variety, Davis notes, and the captain called it a plantain. So this demand for bananas grew. Bananas traveled beautifully. They could be ripened. They were interesting looking. They were easy to eat. And they became extremely popular. Davis says that bananas from Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Costa Rica began to even be shipped in on steamers. And when he was writing in 1906, he observed that by that time, there were 25 million bunches of bananas being imported to the US every year. The fruit is sold at so low a price and so universally used, Davis observed, that I think it is safe to say no fruit, not even apples, has so large a consumption. Now, one of the other important firsts in Plymouth has to do with public safety, and that is the first fire engine in town. Plymouth got its first fire engine sometime after 1757, when it was voted that the town purchase an engine for extinguishing fires. A powerful engine was specified, one that could throw 50 gallons in a minute. This great engine, as it was called, required a team to operate it. And in 1765, 9 men were exempted from the performance of all other town duties in consideration of their appointment to be fire wards, as they were called, wardens, to manage and attend the fire engine and all of the pains and troubles that it involved. By March 1770, the town had acquired a second engine, and once again, town meeting called for appointing fire wards, but this time they recognized the need for additional staff. These were all volunteer, unpaid positions, and these early firefighters often developed very personal connections to their engines, caring for them, polishing them, respecting the technological advances that helped them extinguish fires more efficiently and to protect themselves and their neighbors from the devastating effects of fire. Now, in 1827, the town's fire apparatus was inventoried. There were 4 fire engines of various ages. Some of these were probably those early and aging ones that had come earlier in the century. There were a number 1 and number 2 engine were deemed to be in good working order. Number 3 needed some repairs, and a 4th engine at the rolling mill in Eel River was reported to be in good working condition. And notice that it was at the rolling mill. So with the development of factories all along the town brook, in the downtown area, in North Plymouth, in congested areas with housing, the activities at these mills often created much larger risk of fire. And so the growth of fire suppression and fire staff goes hand in hand with the rise of manufacturing and factories here in Plymouth. Now, in 1828, after that inventory of the 4 engines, a wonderful new advance appeared in Plymouth. This was the new suction engine that was procured, Torrent number 4, which was built by Stephen Thayer of Boston. And Plymouth purchased this suction pumper, which was intended to be hand-drawn, hitched up to horses and hand-drawn, or pulled along the sidebars by a team of firemen, by vote of town meeting for the sum of $400, and it included 400 feet of hose. These hoses were leather, wrapped with cord, and painted. Davis saw the introduction of this, the first suction engine into town, as important an era as that of the first steam machine at a later date. Now, during its history of active use, the Torrent was originally housed on the first floor in the southeast corner of the 1749 courthouse, which was at that time being used as Plymouth's townhouse. And it was later moved into the basement. And then after that, it was relocated to a fire station that existed on Franklin Street in 1886 and was replaced at that time with a newer model, the Hook and Ladder number 1 Excelsior. And eventually, the Torrent was retired from active use. And it came back to the old courthouse building, which was converted into a municipal museum in 1970. And that is where you see it from this picture. It is displayed today and was presented and given to the 1749 Courthouse Committee by the Plymouth Fire Department. Another interesting first and transportation vehicle that you can also find on display at the 1749 Courthouse Museum is the town's first hearse. When Thomas Pope of Plymouth died on July 6, 1820, he introduced this new first to Plymouth, the use of a hearse. Before that time, caskets were carried by pallbearers from the home of the deceased or the church where their service was held up the steep slope of Burial Hill for interment. Look at that slope. But in 1820, the town had the hearse made. a horse-drawn wooden conveyance to make the process of burying the dead much easier to carry out. This hearse was constructed by two local men. Stephen Lucas crafted the running work, that's the wheels and the undercarriage, and Joseph Bramhall of the Bramhall family that still has a very wonderful presence here in our town today, down at Bramhall's Corner and Bramhall's Country Store. Joseph Bramhall was the one who made the box, the wooden body of the hearse. This hearse was used at Burial Hill for about 35 years. And when the town finally purchased a new hearse, it relegated this old one to be used for a time in South Plymouth. By that time, about 1855, 1856, the original hearse was showing signs of wear. It was in rough shape. It needed a new box made for it, which was made by Samuel Nelson. And it had another generation of use in South Plymouth until it was replaced finally there as well with a newer version. The old hearse returned to Burial Hill, where it was, as we saw, displayed outdoors for many years as a curiosity until it was given by the cemetery department to the 1749 courthouse, which had just been gutted of most of its colonial elements in 1970 and renovated as a town museum. And you can see it there today. Now, associated with this hearse is, there's Burial Hill and the slope that you would have to carry that heavy casket up that steep unpaved slope in all weathers. And there is Clement Bates, who was born in 1792, died 1885. He was a local caulker and graver, so someone who would do caulking, for example, on ships, and also could do carving and engraving. And he became Plymouth sexton in the year 1831. He'd been born in Hanover, but had moved to Plymouth and married, I love to say this, it sounds so legendary. He married the lighthouse keeper's daughter, Irene Sanger Burgess. And then after she died, he married her sister, Betsy. Now, from the 1749 courthouse, Sexton Bates attended to all the funerals and burials of the town, using the town hearse to transport bodies up the dirt path that was the access to the burying ground, until in 1897, stone steps were constructed, funded by a bequest from the Joseph H. Stickney, from an individual, Joseph H. Stickney of Baltimore, who fell in love with Plymouth and did a lot of improvements, including the steps, this wonderful granite access points of Burial Hill. Bates' first official task was actually to bury the previous sexton, George Morton, and over the course of a long career, he claimed to have gathered in, as he called it, and buried 3,250 residents. Now, as sexton, Bates also took care of the courthouse building, which after 1820 had ceased to be the county courthouse and had become the townhouse, Plymouth's seat of local government. The sexton was responsible for ringing the town bell, housed next door in what was then the First Parish Church, 3 to 5 times daily, or as directed by town officials. He rang the bell every day for 50 years before he retired from his office in 1885. Now, William T. Davis, who tells us about Clement Bates, found it interesting that Bates, after so long a period of business dealings with the material bodies of the dead, became a confirmed believer in the doctrines of spiritualism. So that brings us to our next verse, and I'm taking a bit of a leap with this one. I'm going to say that this woman was the first spiritualist medium in Plymouth. She was certainly the most famous spiritualist medium in Plymouth. This is Lizzie Doughton, born 1827 on April 1st, one of 9 children of Captain Samuel Doughton and Rebecca Bradford Doughton. She supported herself for most of her adult life as a spiritualist medium and lecturer and author, and was an active proponent of women's rights. She published several collections of verses, numerous essays or sermons, as her brother Alf used to call them, on spiritualism. She published a domestic novel. She edited a spiritualist periodical, Lily of the Valley. And eventually, she married a longtime companion, Z. Adams Willard, in 1902 when she was in her 70s. She died in Brookline, January 4th, 1913, at age 35. Now, her father, Samuel Doughton of Plymouth, 1783 to 1861, was a shipmaster, a builder and owner of vessels, and later a lumber merchant, and he was a direct descendant of Edward Doughty, the Mayflower passenger. In 1807, Captain Doughton married his third wife, Rebecca Bradford, a fourth generation descendant of Plymouth Colony Governor William Bradford, and that couple had 6 daughters: Rebecca, Laura, Euphemia, Cornelia, Eunice, and Elizabeth, or our Lizzie, and also 3 sons, Samuel, Alfred, and Charles. Lizzie's older sisters, Rebecca, Laura, and Euphemia, married when she was quite young, and her brother Alf, with whom she had been very, very close as a child, went out to California during the gold rush to make his fortune, and he remained out there pursuing a number of other ventures, including becoming a journalist and a failed attempt at a silver mine in Nevada. His terrifically detailed journals, which he kept daily throughout, pretty much throughout his life, were published by the University of Nevada in 1973, and there's tons of information in them about the people here of Plymouth, his relations and friends, and his continuing connection with East Coast, West Coast. And the youngest of the 3 Doughton boys, Charles Doughton, spent time for a while as a surveyor out in Minnesota. He later returned back to his hometown, to Plymouth, and worked in the telegraph office and also as a bookseller before establishing himself as editor of the town newspaper, the Old Colony Memorial. The eldest son of the family, Samuel Doughton, who had been born in the year 1812, served as a collector of the port in Plymouth, as well as an accountant and sometimes a dealer in lumber and coal. And when the war broke out in 1861, both Charles and Samuel enlisted right away and served as Union officers. You can find them, they're interred in Oak Grove Vine Hills Cemetery, and you can see there the graves of these Union soldiers. Now, Lizzie's sister Cornelia married locally a Plymouth man, Stephen Burbank, in 1852, and she remained out here in the East, tending to her home and her family here. But like Lizzie, Cornelia Burbank also lectured and wrote. But back to Lizzie. She lectured widely for most of her adult life, both locally here in Plymouth, but also in Boston, throughout New England, and in other regions of the country. She really was very peripatetic and was out there. This is what she did for her living. Like other early spiritualists, her presentations were part lecture, but also part trance. And this combination provided women in particular an unusual opportunity to be center stage, speaking publicly about their beliefs, their ideas about social reform, the need for change. In Lizzie's case, she talked while she was giving these lectures. Partly she is just presenting her information very matter-of-factly, and part of it she's going into a trance state and providing information that way. But the things that she really wanted to communicate to people, in addition to her spiritual beliefs, were to argue very vehemently for extending social and political rights to women. And she also included some critiques of the marital state, of the system of marriage and the conditions and legal strictures of marriage at the time, that many women were under an economic necessity to enter into, but which could tremendously handicap them in many ways by not allowing them equality in marriage under the law. She often would end her lectures by going into a trance state and reciting poetry channeled through spirits. In 1864, she published her first poetry collection, Poems from the Inner Life. And in this book, she expressed her belief in the mysterious depths of the inner life, where all souls can hold communion with those invisible beings who are our companions both in time and eternity. She was guided by as she put it, the advice of these invisible intelligences, in combination, however, with her own judgment. In acknowledging that many people would be skeptical of her beliefs, she emphasized really her own personal spiritual experience. And she said it gave her strength for the present and hope for the future. And at some point in the lives of these skeptics, she said, doubters might become interested in seeking such revelations themselves. Until then, you and I, regarding things from a different point of view, must inevitably understand them differently, she wrote. Some of the poems presented in her 1864 collection were written under specific spirit influences, including famous individuals like Shakespeare and Robert Burns, and others were her own compositions. Now, in 1868, a couple of years later, Lizzie publishes a novel, Hesper, the Home Spirit, a story of household labor and love. And it is about a 15-year-old heroine named Hesper Grayson, who struggles to help support her impoverished family. The father in this story is unable to work due to an injury and a recurring illness, and even more afflicting to young Hester is his dark, or Hesper, I should say, is his dark and critical disposition. The weary mother is nearly bedridden. She's got a household full of children, including a mentally impaired toddler, and not enough support to help. Hesper, her favorite brother tries to help by working long hours in the local rolling mill, which Plymouth, of course, had, but he longs to escape to the sea. And this erratic household is contrasted with a poor, uneducated family that lives next door, and at the other end of the spectrum, a very disagreeable aunt's rigidly correct and proper home. So with Hesper's mother ailing, her father depressed and perhaps cruel, and the unsympathetic aunt selfishly focused on finishing a fancy bed quilt rather than helping her relatives in need, this young heroine had to find a way to cope when her brother departs and finally becomes a mariner and leaves for the sea. The novel contains very gritty descriptions of mill operations as well as the effects of poverty and depression, and it's possible these were drawn for some of the author's own experiences here in Plymouth. In her writings, Lizzie Doughton credits her finely strung nervous system with drawing her to spiritualism. She describes herself as a quiet and sensitive child who often sat by the fireside with her head and her face in her apron. She would seclude herself for hours in a dark closet, praying and weeping until she fell into a trance, and then she would revive, consoled by the assurance from whence I could not tell that somewhere in the future I should find all the life and light and freedom that my soul desired. And Lizzie, through her spiritualist practice, through her professional life as a lecturer, an author, and a medium, did indeed find life, light, and freedom. She says that credited to her temperament, her unutterable yearning for beauty and harmony, that made it almost inevitable that she would become a meaning and catch the thrill of the innumerable voices resounding through the universe and translate their messages into human language. This is one of her poems that was written under the spirit influence through her own voice. She described herself, when the voice was speaking through her, it would be like a harp being played by other powers, but still the harp is itself. O ye who sit and gaze on life with folded hands and fettered will, who see only amid the strife the dark supremacy of ill, know that like birds and streams and flowers, the life that moves you is divine. Nor time, nor space, nor human powers your godlike spirit can confine. Lizzie Doughton died at age 85 in 1913. A brief obituary appeared in the New York Times. But it's really fun to go online and find on Internet Archive some of her publications and learn more about that rather extraordinary first medium of Plymouth. We're going to end our talk with an extraordinary individual, Alba Martinelli Thompson. She was the first woman on Plymouth's Select Board. And in 1942, at the age of 23, Alba Martinelli, a Plymouth High School honors graduate, became the first Plymouth woman to join up in World War II, and she was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Women's Army Air Corps. Pretty extraordinary for the time. She was assigned to the 515th Parachute Infantry, having been trained in the use of pistol, carbine, and submachine gun. She served in the Pacific Theater on General Douglas MacArthur's staff and also as a civil affairs officer in Japan, China, and Korea at the end of the war. And from 1946 to 1952, she was in Korea, first as an adjutant of the Bureau of Agriculture and Commerce, and then as a reserve major with the military police and a specialist in Far Eastern affairs. There she met her husband, Reserve Colonel Lauren B. Thompson, and had a baby. And then the Army ousted her. Major Thompson fought to retain her rank. Her dispute with the Defense Department made national news with headlines like "Woman Major Wants Baby, Army Career," and "Mother Fights to Keep Rank of Army Major." She's quoted in the Traverse City Record Eagle, Traverse City, Michigan in 1952. "Mrs. Thompson doesn't think that just because a woman has a baby, she shouldn't be permitted to stay in the Army and, quote, defend her home, which has become all the dearer because a child has come into it," end quote. Her plight caught the attention of several United States senators, and they actually passed a bill to prevent the automatic dismissal of women reservists with young children, but it failed to pass in the House. After raising her family in New Jersey, Alba Thompson moved back home to Plymouth and found new ways to serve. She became the first woman elected to the Plymouth Board of Selectmen in March of 1986, and later became chair. She was the champion of veterans' issues. She was the driving force in opening a local veterans clinic. And her uniform, the U.S. Women's Army Auxiliary Corps uniform from her time of active service, which is in the stewardship of the American Legion History Museum at Memorial Hall, is currently on display at Pilgrim Hall Museum's Pathfounders exhibit on the women of Plymouth. I think Alba Martinelli Thompson, native of Plymouth, high school graduate, and truly an extraordinary individual, is a great first to conclude today's talk. I hope you will all join us next month, Saturday, October 2nd at 1 p.m. Dr. David Landon, I think actually I have there's Alba. Dr. David Landon is going to be presenting the latest archaeological findings from Burial Hill. It's going to be tremendously exciting. And that concludes our presentation for today. I thank our partners and the technical assistance from my wonderful colleague Ann Mason at the Plymouth Antiquarian Society and from Pilgrim Hall Museum. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next month.